On Press Perspective today, we touch upon the Trump administration's latest tariffs to South Korea's property taxes to stock market jitters. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Tuesday, August 11th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. From U.S. tariffs to South Korea's property tax reform to local stock market concerns, we take a closer look at the key economic developments shaping the country and what they mean for businesses, investors and households. For more on this, I have independent journalist Kelly Kasulis Cho here in the studio. Kelly, it's great to have you here.
Happy to be here, thanks.
I also have Professor Yu Jong-min at Hongik University joining the session virtually. Professor Yu, as always, it's a pleasure.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Lovely. We start here in the studio. Kelly, let's begin with details of the Trump administration's 15% tariff and a series of price floors on products made from polysilicon.
Right. So to start, polysilicon, for those who don't know, it's a key component that's used in solar panels and semiconductors. In terms of the global demand for it, it's quite high, and it's currently 90% supplied by China. The U.S. actually used to be the largest supplier of polysilicon, but that has changed in recent times. So setting that up, knowing that it's something that we need for, key technology as well as defense technology, and it's mostly coming from China, the Trump administration announced on Thursday basically a signed declaration saying that they intend to, one, set a minimum price for polysilicon. The idea there is to allow U.S. manufacturers or other manufacturers to make a little bit of profit on this material, whereas maybe before they couldn't compete with the Chinese market. So essentially having a minimum price, which will probably be higher than it is right now, as well as putting a 15% tariff on any product that has polysilicon in it or is made with it. That said, there was a little bit of a caveat in the announcement saying that if you have an explicit trade agreement with the United States, there might be an exception granted to you, so you may not be hit with that 15% tariff. But basically, the argument is that the Trump administration wants to boost national production of this product. As far as the United States is concerned, it's never a good thing when they need something very badly, and the majority of it is supplied by China or maybe a power that it is a little bit adversarial with. We've seen similar issues with the critical minerals that come out of China. And the other argument for this is that this declaration was made out of a national security concern. So the chips that are made in part with this polysilicon are really important for defense systems, radar control systems, things that at least the Trump administration says is really critical for the U.S. military, and therefore that justifies this kind of executive action.
Professor Yu, do tell us a bit more about the purpose of these latest U.S. tariffs and how do they look to affect South Korean businesses?
So let's say the most of the tariff has an aim to boost up this domestic production, of course, but especially for this case, let's say for example, in the U.S. market, let's say there are several importers who is selling similar products. But what if they have a similar, exactly same tax rate, for example, in this case, 15%? Then, if they're competing each other in the U.S. market, but if they have an exactly same level of tax rate, tariff rate, then among the importers, there are not much difference in their prices after the tax. So, of course, there should be some advantage, price advantage for the U.S. Domestic producer, but not much for the importers. So if I'm asked about what would be the effect for the Korean exporter, who's producing in Korea, then I can say there are not much of big impact for them. But at the end of that kind of market, at the end, consumers in the United States may have a burden for increased priced by the added after the tax. So right now, what is the purpose of the this kind of tax policy? Of course, there should be protect the domestic producer of the U.S. But I think that right now President Trump's administration right now is aiming to maintain its cash flow from the tax policy, and then actually the that kind of tax policy was turns out to be unlawful by the Supreme Court and the U.S. Court of the International Trade. But right now they are trying to introduce the new kinds of tariff policy, and that's right now this current 15% of the tax rate. But I don't think that kind of tax policy doesn't have a big impact compared to the inflation rate. Inflation rate actually slowed down the economy, and also from the perspectives of economists, I think that the tax effect cannot be bigger than the cash rate effect. So that's kind of an undeniable fact for me.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, here in South Korea, Kelly, the Lee Jae-myung administration has unveiled its property tax reform. Could you walk us through the changes and the public response?
Well, simply put, if I'm going to keep this very succinct, and for the average viewer, President Lee's administration has launched higher taxes, a plan for higher taxes for high-value investment properties. The reason why this matters is President Lee, I think when he first was elected, a lot of people wondered, this another Minju Party leader, maybe there will be a double down focus on North Korea, and that will be kind of the national news headline that's always coming out of the Blue House. But actually, the Western media has been paying a lot of attention to his property reform and his tax reforms, and really his campaign against the high cost of living in Seoul. So for those that don't live here, I wrote a piece for this about this for the Christian Science Monitor, but in Seoul, property taxes have gone up about 19% last year, and they've gone up quite a bit over the last 5 or 6 years. In fact, in some parts of Seoul, it's more than doubled. And nationally, even outside of Seoul, we're talking about a 9% increase. So that's certainly not on pace with wages, and it's becoming harder and harder to own, which is a really important thing for most Korean families. Korea has some of the highest home ownership rates in the OECD, much more than Europe and the United States. Having a deed to the place that you live is very culturally significant here. And President Lee has really blamed a lot of these ails or these problems on property speculation. And he has really tied this problem very closely to the birth rate issue and other major social ails in South Korea. So he essentially argues that the fact that people can't afford a place to live that they can own rather than rent as one of the main reasons for why people are not getting married and therefore not having children. And culturally speaking, there's a high correlation there. People do feel that they need to at least buy property in order to have kids. Maybe they get married and they buy property together by pooling finances. I believe there's just a piece in the New York Times about how more people are trying to get married just to simply pool 2 incomes together than in years prior, and the income matters more. So when we're talking about property speculation, we're talking about people who buy up multiple homes, seeing them as investments and a way to get rich over time. I think, most people who are buying in Seoul do kind of view real estate in this way. Like culturally, in other parts of the world, people might see buying a house as simply buying a place to live. The amount that they're paying is worth it if they can have a stable place to live, whereas Korean people kind of see it as their stock market, their way to build long-term wealth and get ahead financially. So you have a system where for many years, according to the Lee administration at least, and some economists that I spoke with, housing economists, that you have a situation where people were taking out mortgages and loans for houses that they can't really afford. We're talking about the aspirational apartment in Gangnam. Like maybe they could have afforded a villa in a very desirable Seoul district, but if they're thinking, if I want to make that much of an investment. I also want it to be my retirement plan, my way to get rich, my way to build wealth. And so a lot of these, viable units have been swallowed up by people that either already have the means to buy multiple apartments or are willing to take out really egregious loans in order to hopefully make a buck in the end. And so there's been a crackdown broadly, without getting into all of the details of the policies, because I'm also not an economist, but kind of explaining the greater themes here. The Yi administration has been trying to encourage people to invest more in the stock market rather than seeing buying property as their only way to build wealth. It's been trying to incentivize people taking out mortgages for homes that they can actually afford in Seoul, rather than these really expensive apartment complexes that most people, including people that work at major conglomerates, cannot afford. And really working on cracking down on lenders so that people who are not taking out mortgages, basically, or loans for homes that they can't afford. And the idea is that I think the idea is in part to change a little bit of the cultural attitude towards home ownership. Like, this is something I'm buying to raise my kids in and have some stability. It's not necessarily a way of getting rich. That's the idea. But also to avoid the situation where people are, borrowing tons of money from family members, from banks, from private institutions, to buy an apartment in Gangnam and then immediately try to rent it out as jeonse to pay back some of that initial capital that they were taking. So it's a really complicated system, but all of it is to say that they're trying to incentivize people to buy homes that are actually within their salary range and are reasonable, and to try to stop people from eating up the housing stock, which is very limited, and trying to get rich in the process.
Right. Professor Yu, I wonder, could you explore the merits and setbacks of this latest reform in South Korea's property tax for us?
Yeah, I mostly agree with what the Kelly has mentioned about the high prices of the Korean real estate market, especially for the housing, the apartments, and then. So your question is about the so what is the good things and bad things for the latest reform of the property tax? So I think it should be done someday. Of course, if this regime can perform this kind of a property tax reform, yeah, that would be excellent. But I'm not really satisfied with what he have announced some days ago. But it should be, I think it should be more strengthened over the time. Right now, many people, because the housing price is too high, especially for the Gangnam area and Seoul area, many people even say like how high housing prices working like a contraceptive measure for the young generation. So it's really important for the future generation. So what is the good things for the for this property tax policy? Yes, it's very good for the future generation because it pushes down. It has some economic. It could be economic measures to push the prices down, and especially for the property tax, it could be a very big burden for the owners. For most of the developed countries, the property tax rate is almost like 1% of its value. So 1% of its cash outflow from their revenue is actually very big. It's very big. So also the current government of Korea has also recognized that 1% is too high for them right now. It's almost 1/3 of the 1%. I mean, 0.3% or something like that. So it could be a very big burden. So they're gonna probably trying to sell their house in the market, so it can push the price down. But if the bad things for the what would be the bad effect for that? It will be a burden for the homeowners, of course. Homeowners, they should sell their property if they really want to avoid that kind of cash outflow. So right now, government also is considering about what if they lose vote because of this high rate of property tax. So, but someday they should be done in the market in terms of the sound real estate market. So so far, government has performed lots of policies, including bank mortgage control and city renovation, and also capital gain tax and acquisition tax rate, or tax for the rent revenue. But the tax for the rent revenue is only for the consumer, commercial real estate, and also the tax for the capital gain and tax for the acquisition. It's just a freestyle market. So I believe that property tax is the only measure that we can do. We can actually press down the real estate prices. So I hope that the policymaker really recognize this issue. But I'm pretty sure they already know that. But they are just avoid to have this policy real, because they just do not want to lose their vote in the election.
Right. For now, the reform itself has also prompted quite a bit of social commentary. Kelly, earlier on, you mentioned the local stock market. There's been quite a bit of foreign media coverage about the market and the concerns raised by retail investors in the South Korean stock market. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so the reason why I think there's so much concern right now, speaking to the earlier two questions about the housing market, there's a lot of middle-income Korean people, especially young people, who really don't have any hopes of buying a home anytime soon because of the skyrocketing prices. And so back in May and June, when Kospi was, growing in value exponentially, some of these people were putting really honestly their entire life savings or significant portions of it in the Kospi. I have personally spoken with people that have done this. I have friends that have done this. And now we're seeing this series of small, precipitous drops that recover a little bit, but that cause a lot of shock and concern in the market, and it's certainly getting the foreign media's attention. So just this month, I believe Kospi is down about 22%. And when we talk about retail investors, we're talking about individuals like myself who are not professionals, who are buying and selling things like stocks and bonds with the hopes of at least beating inflation, but really growing some kind of wealth, because the traditional ways of doing that, such as in buying properties and them going up in value over our lifetime, is no longer available for the average person. So in May and June, when this was really a hot topic and people were extremely optimistic about Kospi, I read that 54.2 billion US dollars worth of retail investor average person trades were happening. So we're talking about an exceptional amount of capital. And now that things are going down and there's causing some kind of like market panic here or there, like those kind of short headlines are always in the news. It's creating the sense that people are becoming even more worried about the future. There's some real financial loss if they're selling. And when this was happening, when there was this optimism, this was brought up by many economists and pundits, including on Arirang, I'm sure, because we're talking about an index that really 50% of which is made up of two companies, Samsung and SK Hynix. And I think this is yet another story of how the AI boom is getting a lot of people excited about growing wealth. Like we think about the dot-com boom, that was kind of a similar thing. A lot of people in my generation joke about, like, I hate that I was 8 years old in the dot-com boom and I couldn't make investments, but that bubble burst as well, right? So there's a lot of attention being paid to it because Korea is a major economic player on the global stage. The won right now, although it appears to be recovering against the dollar, there's been a lot of volatility there. And now there's all these young people that put 30, 40, 50, 100 million won, which can't buy them a house, in this index, into Kospi, and they're losing some of it potentially.
Right. Professor Yu, an opinion piece carried by Bloomberg also raised concerns about investment in South Korea. Could you touch upon the concerns raised and your response?
Yeah, I've read the article, and then the article was mostly about the National Korea National Pension Fund. Deliberately, they kind of delayed their decision to re-rating of the stock investment. And also, one of the other issues was that Korean people especially, they are really interested in a very speculative investment, really. But the government has allowed them to invest the leveraged ETF for the individual stocks. So that's the two things that that article, the Bloomberg article, has mentioned about and blaming. But so their title was like a Korea stock market is not investable anymore. But I kind of that article has had a very key point and very understandable. And then too much volatile market makes the Korean market not investable. So I partly agree on that. So, but something that I don't really agree is that you know what, the Korea National Pension Fund, they also have their incentive to maximize their profit. You know, of course, they have a public role to stabilize the Korean stock market, but because they have the other jobs to maximize their own wealth, so they kind of try to concentrate their investment for the stocks that's growing growing faster compared to the other stocks. So I kind of understandable that these pension guys can deliberately weigh more for the Samsung Electronics or AJ Hynix. So that's something that I can understandable. And the other thing is that Koreans are, I mentioned that Koreans are really love the very speculative investment, such as like leverage the ETF or the futures and options. So even the old lady who's living in neighborhood also suggested me to invest Kospi. She said oh, you're an economic professor, and why don't you invest your money in Kospi? And then I realized that people are now getting being insensitive to the risk of the market, and then that actually really market becomes more volatile and very risky. So for decades, actually, there was a huge Korean discount, but recently we have a high overvaluation. So I think that all the responsibility that we should bear is on the investors. So we need to think very carefully about whether the market is overvaluated or undervalued.
Right, it's always better to be safe than sorry then. Professor Yu Jong-min at Hongik University, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Kelly here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you as well.
Right, that brings us to the end of this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.